I want to take several lectures to talk about progressivism, which is a large movement, an ideology, which emerged in the very early 20th century, late 19th century. It's a reform movement that took its name from the people who left the Republican Party in 1912 to join Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party. That was the actual name of the party, the Progressive Party. But the term progressivism is used in a broader sense to refer to a much older, larger group of individuals. And that's how we're going to use it. As early as 1900, these reformers set out to cleanse and reinvigorate an America they considered in decline. They wanted to rid politics of corruption, tame the trust, and reform vice, specifically things like drinking, prostitution, gambling, which they saw as the ills of this new urban civilization. They first appeared in municipal politics, because that's where the problems were, and they moved on to the state level, and finally the national level. Both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson considered themselves progressives. While President Taft did not, you'll find from your reading that his record actually is quite progressive. Progressives were a large group, often had conflicting goals, but they agreed on one big principle: the need for activist government to right political, social, and economic wrongs. Eventually, they saw that only the federal government really could accomplish these goals. This positive attitude toward government marked an important change in American politics. Very importantly, rather than view a centralized government as the enemy of liberty, as say a Jeffersonian would, progressives began to see it as liberty's guarantor. The populists had failed with this idea, but progressives would build a new and different case and would succeed. Now, progressivism first emerged among the young, middle-class Protestant people who felt alienated from society. This explains why initially the Republican Party was the party of reform, because middle-class Protestants would most likely be Republicans, at least in the North. This alienation from society I'm referring to is really what Marx was referring to. Also, maybe what Henry Adams referred to his ennui, his disconnection, dissatisfaction with modern society that he wrote about in his autobiography of Henry Adams. Many of these young progressives were raised in devout homes where religious feeling was high and was a spur to social action. They might have thought they were going to become missionaries or the like, and while many went in other directions, they didn't lose their zeal to correct wrongs. They became ministers of reform. They were distressed by principally two things: corruption in politics and wealth stratification resulting from the Gilded Age. Some of these retained their faith. William Jennings Bryan, the former populist, became an ardent progressive and evangelical, stating that Christian piety and American democracy had an integral relationship. Billy Sunday was a former baseball player and became the most theatrical, famous preacher of the day. Good name for a preacher, Billy Sunday. And he turned his opposition to saloons and what he called the liquor trust into a giant crusade. Now, Protestants, I've talked about the Protestant nature of progressivism. Protestants were obviously a giant group, most of America at the time, and they were very diverse, and many were not interested in reform. And it's helpful to identify some smaller, more cohesive groups of reformers that might be termed progressives. We're going to look at three. They're by no means comprehensive, but these three groups will be instructive: muckrakers, settlement house workers, and socialists. We're only going to talk about, throughout the rest of this lecture, muckrakers. We'll get to the next two next time. Now, the term muckraker, it means somebody who stirs up crap, basically. It was coined by Teddy Roosevelt, and he meant it critically, referring to journalists creating sensational stories for money. But it became a badge of honor for journalists committed to exposing the seedy side of America. And these muckrakers had one startling revelation after another. A woman named Ida Tarbell wrote a series of articles which revealed the shady practices with which J.D. Rockefeller had turned Standard Oil into a monopoly. The trust, monopolistic business was her subject. A guy named Lincoln Steffens wrote about corruption in city governments. A guy named George Kibbe Turner wrote about the problems with cities, how saloons and houses of prostitution had a disintegrating effect on family life in urban and ethnic ghettos. I couldn't find a picture of George Kibbe Turner, but I found a picture of a McClure's magazine with his name in it. I put an arrow there. That's good because McClure's, we'll talk about in a minute, magazines like McClure's grew very popular during this era, and they were the channel through which muckrakers delivered their information, and they wanted to shock the people into social action. The tradition of investigative journalism reached back to the 1870s when newspapers and magazines, you'll recall, exposed Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. Now, the rise of muckrakers in the 20th century reflected two trends, two things we've already talked about, two features of urbanization or urban culture. One was the economic reason of expanded newspaper and magazine circulation. And the second was the intellectual reason of realism. Let's talk about the first, increased newspaper and magazine circulation. From 1870 to 1909, daily newspapers rose from 574 daily newspapers to 2,600, and circulation increased from under 3 million to more than 24 million people receiving and reading a paper. Magazines were transformed in the 1890s. Cheap 10-cent periodicals like McClure's and Ladies' Home Journal, with circulations, big circulations, 400,000 to 1 million perhaps, replaced more genteel, older 35-cent publications like Harper's and Atlantic Monthly. Although Harper's and Atlantic Monthly also grew in circulation and continued to grow, and they also were formats for muckraking literature. The Atlantic Monthly is still my favorite magazine. It's one of the best periodicals in the English language, actually. This expanded readership brought journalists more money and prestige, raised their job to that of a respected profession, and it also made magazines receptive to sensational stories that would appeal to their newly acquired millions of readers. This helped fuel muckraking, obviously, and muckraking led to calls for social reform. The middle class's growing interest in realism also favored the muckrakers. Realism prized detachment, objectivity, skepticism. The muckrakers pointed out that the study of the Constitution, things like citizenship, elections, democratic procedures, the things they studied, had little to do with the way government actually worked. What could one learn about bosses and machines from studying the Constitution? No, you had to study the real thing. They also rejected, it's an example of realism in reporting, they also rejected the nation's glorification of the self-made man and individualism because they felt it prevented Americans from dealing effectively with large-scale organizations that were suddenly central to America's economy and society. The realists also criticized the tendency among intellectuals to emulate European styles and urged the creation of new styles to capture American life and thought. We've already talked about some of the literature and the art, the ashcan artist. But it permeated far more than just visual art and literature. By the first decade of the 20th century, intellectuals of all sorts, philosophers, John Dewey, he was the guy, by the way, who was driving this focus on practical, real skills in education, and William James, philosopher William James, novelist Theodore Dreiser, we've talked about, and Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which was both a realist novel and a muckraking piece of journalism that so gripped America it led to regulation of the meatpacking industry. The ashcan painters, obviously, photographers Jacob Riis, Lewis Hine, architects Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, father of the skyscraper, and even jurists, legal thinkers like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and Louis Brandeis. They were attempting to create truer, more representative ways of representing and analyzing American society. Many of them were inspired by the work of investigative journalists, and some had been journalists. Years of first-hand observation enabled them to describe America as it truly was, corrupt, ruthless, and seedy. The growing middle class were uneasy about the state of American society, and they applauded the muckrakers and became interested in reform. This drove progressivism. The middle class put pressure on city and state governments to put crooked officials in jail and stamp out vice. For one example, between 1902 and 1916, those 14 years, more than 100 cities launched investigations of the prostitution trade. Progressivism compelled all three levels of government to begin to address the power of the trust. So realism is not just about muckrakers, but showed the pervasive power of realism that fueled the muckrakers' work. We'll talk about settlement house workers and socialists next time.